On Monday, 26th of June, Mrs. Soup got off work early, and together we drove to Bamburgh. Mrs. Soup very much enjoyed filming the castle as it appeared on the horizon, and it's undeniable actually that approaching the castle via the village of Bamburgh is an interesting experience. Bamburgh itself, the village, is relatively small, very, very charming and quintessentially British. But it's also slightly surreal because it is utterly dominated by the presence of Bamburgh Castle. Looming as it does, sat high on a volcanic outcrop of rock, the current facade of the castle is a combination of medieval and Victorian influences. The last great overhaul and consolidation of this site was done under Lord Armstrong in the 19th century. Since then, the castle has always impressed people, and in recent years Hollywood has come calling. Macbeth with Michael Fassbender was filmed here, and on the beach below, the big friendly giant himself left a footprint in Steven Spielberg's film. And today ArchaeoSoup is returning. We park here behind the castle and make our way to the East Bailey, where the archaeological dig is located. It seems we have arrived in the midst of a tour, and we will return to Graham Young in just a moment. But first, a word about another archaeologist, Brian Hope Taylor. This legendary archaeologist, based at the University of Cambridge, first conducted excavations in the West Bailey in the 1960s and 1970s. Hope Taylor's work on the site was jealously guarded, and therefore at times, to a certain extent, the relationship between the modern excavation and his work is one of rediscovery and synthesis.
At the end of last season, the last couple of weeks, we were so close to joining up with Brian Hope Taylor's higher surface area that we actually re-cleaned one of his longer sections and extended a little sondage into our own surfaces. And at that point we found an exquisite, wonderful cobbled surface, and we think the world of this because the trench is so complicated that every surface and every structure tends to be cut by another. We found this beautifully decorated copper alloy mount, but suddenly we seem to have either a yard, a road, or an internal floor surface which is both extensive and beautifully constructed, and a beautifully dated 8th century artifact from the surface of it. So one of our principal goals this year, if we can make sufficient progress, is to extend that surface out and try and identify whether we're in a building or whether we've got a yard or road surface, and understand where the little bird mount came from. We've got a pretty good understanding of our metalworking phase, which is middle 9th century. Our bird takes us into the 8th century, so we think metalworking continues, but there are lots of different structures poking out of the section into Hope Taylor's dig, so clearly the orientation and the layout of the trench is in constant flux. So I think we're on the cusp of identifying a whole additional phase, so it's quite exciting. But the problem is we've got the rest of this week and 2 more weeks, so whether we can properly understand it before the end of the season, it's going to be a bit of a race. But we really want to get at least some insight into where the bird mount is from, because we quite like to do a little publication over the winter just to get some information out there. So it is fascinating, but it's a little nerve-wracking that we'll get enough information in time. But it's it's wonderful archaeology here at Bamburgh, and it's a privilege to do it. But just occasionally we wish it wasn't quite so complicated and we could move a little faster. But fingers crossed, we'll get the information that we want this year.
Looking to the northwest, we eventually come to the far end of the Bailey. This is actually a section of the castle which was explored extensively on our previous site visit. A link to that will be available at the end of this video. But today is an opportunity to mark very much an end of an era for excavations at Bamburgh.
We have finally reached the end of the road with Trench 1. We've been predicting its demise for a few years now, and we were almost confident that we'd finish it last year, but there were just those last few little bits of features that stretched us over into this year. So we've reached the end of the road. When we first started the excavation back in 2000, we were thinking really of excavating right at this northern tip of the fortress, just to get some information about the defensive structures and some information to go alongside our burial ground excavation. And who knows, hadn't we not inherited Bamburgh Taylor's unfinished excavation in the West Ward here, we might be looking at the end of our excavation within the castle, but at the moment it's just the end of one phase. So it's been a fascinating trench. It's given us a little insight into the high medieval fortress, because the gate here is a postern in the later Middle Ages, and we have one or two timber rooms built against the curtain wall, but it's really a backwater of the castle at that time. But we know from our written records that it is the main entrance to the palace site of the Anglo-Saxon kings. So that was the area we were particularly fascinated with, and we have a whole series of structures associated with that time period. What is likely two phases of a timber phase of defensive rampart, and within that we have a timber hall replaced in stone, dominating the gate, and again we think probably to do with gate wards and the control of access to the royal palace. Last year we did some ambitious sondages across what was the base of the trench into the boulder clay, because the director here had a theory that we might have reworked boulder clay, that it may have been used to fill ramparts, and we might find an earlier undisturbed surface beneath it. But sadly, after several weeks of bone-crushing effort, all we'd succeeded in demonstrating was that indeed it was boulder clay left by the glaciers. So if any students of the last year are watching this, then it was a good idea, but sorry for all the effort. But at least we now know that we've genuinely absolutely bottomed the trench. There's no further archaeological information that we've been missing, and we can start the long, slow process of putting all of the stratigraphy back together and producing our report. This is a piece of dressed masonry that survived from the stone building. We can't date it accurately in the moment. We know that the building was robbed out by the 12th century, possibly just before that. So it's a good candidate for a Middle Saxon stone hall, probably a gatewards hall. And the masonry, it's squared off. It looks like masonry, but it's quite crude in the way that it's tooled. So again, this may fit into some of the earliest masonry that's worked at the castle. So we're going to keep that block. It may well go on the display, because early medieval masonry is quite rare, and we don't have much. We have nothing standing at the castle at the moment from that era. So it's a nice little keepsake and a good small find. We excavated also the second half of a kiln that we discovered quite a few years ago, but we'd only sample excavated to that point. But as the trench was coming to an end, we decided we'd take the other elements out of it, and it does produce a considerable amount of grain. So it's a corn drying kiln. It's actually the high medieval wall is cut into the side of it, so it's one possible indication that we have a stone rampart predating the Norman castle in the early medieval period. But we can't prove it definitively, because unfortunately we can't reach that far. There's a giant masonry over the top of us and it wouldn't be safe. But it's interesting because it cuts through the timber phase of rampart, and we now know from our preliminary examination of the material from it that it's full of oats. So it is a corn drying kiln, but it's drying oats, so it may be an indication that we have horses in the castle, a stable somewhere, probably not a million miles from the gate complex, which is interesting in itself. But then again, it's a very high status site, so having horses to ride perhaps shouldn't come as a shock to us, but it's always nice to get your confirmational evidence that you've got sort of this equestrian culture in our palace site. Because I think it's quite rare for that period. So that's a nice little find, and we're looking forward to all the rest of the analysis and what that will tell us about reconstructing the lifestyles within the fortress. We had a terrific meeting with the castle people, Will Armstrong and Chris, the administrator, and we're going to temporarily backfill the trench, but we're going to leave markers so that we can demark where the wall lines of these buildings ran, probably in gravel on the surface, so visitors can come and see at least the foot plan of the buildings that hopefully they can read about on our website, and in a few years' time perhaps in a book or some good papers on the trench as well. Since it was our first ever trench within the castle, I think it coming to an end is, well, I don't say it's overly emotional, but it is kind of the end of an era. We actually finished Trench 2 earlier, but that was because there was very little to find there, whereas Trench 1 has been an amazing trench. A huge contrast to the other excavation on the industrial complex, and it's taught us so much about structures and buildings and the access and defences of the castle, that it's going to be sad to come back in future seasons and it not be part of our world. So we're probably going to put a little time capsule, which we'll all sign, into the backfill for future generations of archaeologists to find and wonder who these crazy people were. So it's just basically a way of marking the end of an era, I suppose, and a generation of archaeologists who have been trained in this excavation, and several generations of trench supervisors as well. Hopefully we'll get all of them to sign before we backfill our little time capsule, and that'll be a little bit of emotional closure for the end of our trench.
I'm so pleased to have been able to help mark the end of an era at the Bamburgh Research Project, but also potentially hint at pastures new directions, new research agendas, and new people to come. Anyway, Mr. Soup and I very much enjoyed ending our evening with something of a site tradition: Barbecue Mondays. If you would like to know more about the Bamburgh Research Project or their field school, check out the links in the video description below.